We're going to begin this lecture series with cycladic, minoan, and mycenaean culture. So cycladic and minoan specifically are almost what you might call proto-Greece. We don't even really have a Greece yet, and we really don't in the Mycenaean period either, but it's a lot closer. So you'll see there's the cycladic and minoan are closer together in form than the Mycenaean. That changes a little bit. So let's get started. I just have some images here, and I'm just going to point out a few things about them as we go. So this is the part of the world we're looking at here, down here in the Mediterranean, specifically down around this area. There's the Aegean up close to Greece, the Ionian on the other side. All of this down here is the Mediterranean. So this is the part of the world, let me get it right around here, that we're looking at. All right. So Cycladic islands, we'll be looking at the Minoan culture, which is here on Crete, particularly at Knossos, and Mycenae up here on the mainland of what is today is Greece. So we don't know much about the Cycladic cultures on that group of islands, and most of what we have from that time period in terms of artifacts are these little statuettes. We're looking at the 3rd millennium BCE, so about 5,000 years ago. This one's about 24 inches tall. It's one of the taller ones. We don't really know what they were meant for. They're sometimes buried with skeletons, so they might have just been grave goods, but without a written document to go along with it, we really don't know a lot about what these figures were for, what they represented. And again, this is sort of what we have from the Cycladic period. So as we move on, we'll go right into Minoan, where we do know a little bit more. There is some text from the Minoan culture that has been translated. There are a couple of types of writings, and one we have pretty much been able to translate, mostly information about shipping and things like that, inventories, and the other language still hasn't been adequately deciphered. So we don't know a lot about the people of Knossos. What we do have is this palace complex. A lot of it has been restored. We don't know how accurately it's been restored, but it's a really lovely complex. We can see the painting here on a lot of the buildings, repainted based on paint fragments that they found. We always think of Greece as being a land of like white buildings and white statues, and that's not really true. They were a lot of them were actually painted, and of course that painting is just gone now. So this is the Palace of Knossos, where we have the famous story of the Minotaur and the labyrinth. That kind of all grows out of this palace complex. And you can see what a big complex it was. On your screen you can see this more closely and see what they have identified all of these little buildings and rooms as being for. So what we see are a lot of light wells that get light down to the bottom stories. We see these columns that are very plain. They do, this one back here you can probably see the most clearly, where we can see the column is more narrow at the base and gets wider as it goes up. And then there's just big cushion capital up there. Very, very plain, but ingeniously developed this palace complex so that light can get into a lot of places with these things called light wells, W-E-L-L-S, light wells. There are a lot of frescoes, Minoan frescoes at this palace complex. We don't know what was happening in the frescoes, and a fresco, of course, is painting on a wall, so you can imagine they're not in very good shape, and you can tell that a lot of this is recreated. There's not much left of the original. I think these darker spots are the original, and then they've been reconstructed, probably based on other images that have been found. So we have a good idea of these, of what should be on this fresco. And we see this peculiar idea. It looks like they're doing acrobatics on a bull. Bull seems to be a pretty important animal for the Minoans, although we don't know exactly why. There are myths that surround bulls, and of course the stories about the Minotaur at Knossos. We have two females on either side here, and this would be a male vaulting over the horse. The females would have been lighter in color, and the males darker. That's kind of standard in a lot of the ancient world. And we'll talk more about the Minoan figures and how they relate to Egyptian figures elsewhere. So here again we have a goddess. We call her the snake goddess because we really don't know what she is. We see this figure a lot in the Minoan art and architecture, the paintings, and another Minoan figure. It's called Mistress of the Beasts. Again, that's our name for her. We have no idea what she was originally called. And you see this curious Egyptian thing I was talking about, where we have the body kind of frontal. It looks like her legs are going to be pointing off to one side, and her face is in profile as well, so we only see the one eyeball, even though her torso is facing us. And this gives us an idea that possibly the Egyptians and the Minoans were in contact with each other, and they're duplicating each other's art forms. When we go up to the mainland, to Mycenae, we come across an excavation. Heinrich Schliemann was determined to find the location of the city of Troy that was mentioned in Homer's The Iliad, and based on clues in the epic itself, he found a spot that he has called Troy. Wasn't just one Troy, it was many levels of the city that had been rebuilt over and over and over, but he excavated, and we call it Troy now. And he found all of these items there. This would have been a funerary mask in gold, so this would have been the mask made of someone's face after they died. So he found lots of gold at this location. This is Mycenae. As far as we can tell, for the most part, the Minoans on Crete were not a particularly warlike people, but the people in Mycenae were very war-oriented. So you'll see a lot of these fortifications around their forts. This one's called the Citadel of Mycenae, and you would have had farming up here in the hills. So they're not quite on the water as they would have been in Crete. The Minoan palaces would have been, the palaces would have been closer to the ocean. In the Mycenaean culture, they would not necessarily have been, but very well fortified. You can tell that they're building defensively. All right. You can also tell the difference in the artwork between the two that gives some clues to their Minoan, not necessarily warlike. This is a vase of some sort that has sea life painted on it. And the Mycenaean, who were a little warrior-oriented. We have lots of vases with warriors and soldiers painted on it. Gives us a good clue as to how they were equipped in terms of weapons and battle formations and things like that. We get a lot of information from the vases. So vases provide us with a lot of information about the ancient world. So more of a I don't want to say gentle culture, that's taking it too far, but maybe not a society as concerned as much with war and heroics as the Mycenaean culture may have been. The architecture is sometimes called Cyclopean, for the Cyclops, and you've already encountered him in the little bit we read from the Odyssey, because these in later periods, these stones were seen as being so massive, the only way that people could envision these having been constructed was by a cyclops, by giants. So this is pretty standard architecture, post and lintel, L-I-N-T-E-L, right? So this is a pretty standard type of architecture. We have this triangle right here. It's called a relieving triangle, and we'll talk about corbelling later. When you put bricks over each other like this, it's called corbelling. And sometimes these relieving triangles are empty, In this case, they were filled with a sculpture of two lions whose heads are now missing. But this would have been the entrance into one part of the citadel of Mycenae called the Lion Gate. Here inside of what's called the Treasury of Atreus, and actually we think it's probably more of a tomb, we see more of this corbelling, where you have rows of bricks, each row overlapping the previous row a little bit, so that it makes a kind of a vault, a dome, and then all this would have been sanded down so that it was nice and even. Yeah, I don't have a shot of the top of this. You can find a lot of these online where you can actually see all the way at the top. And on the outside it would have been covered with dirt so that it would have looked like it was part of the landscape, a hill. All right, and that takes care of our first video in this series.